Doing it. I'm recording.
Nice. All right. So at long last, we have convened our meeting.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
All right.
After our meeting about the meeting.
Yep, we've just been discussing agenda for today. Um,
So yeah.
Jenny, did you quickly go over that?
So yeah, physicality, leading into neural OS, uh, leading into the neural OS structure. So sorry, physicality, holonic structure, neural OS structure, and potentially, if we get to it, the mapping of holonic structure to the neural OS layers.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we will. That would be our first meeting. So we're limited to 45-minute chunks with Zoom. But that's good and fine. So we have three. So we have a fork then, two other meetings which go in two different directions.
I think there'll be a set of meetings that are interlaced. So like we'll have a meeting about one topic and then the other topic. So it'll be kind of like as above, so below, kind of. And then we could potentially relate them to each other because we've already had some content from them.
Yep.
If we have especially if we have multiples.
Yeah. So we're dealing with the challenge of the fractal structure.
Yeah.
And how to navigate it. We're basically just arbitrarily picking a strike point with an objective of a bunch of things that we want to cover, and we're just going with it.
Yep.
So after the fork, we could get into the guild, discussing the guild types, fundamental, natural, proximity, maybe the natural guild stack. On the other end of the fork, we have memetics. With the complexes, I guess the mimetic cycle, the affect nexus.
Yeah. Yep. Affect. But then we have like the what would I call it? I don't even know what to call it yet. It doesn't have a name, really.
So from there, we could get into then the primordial archetype stacks and pure potential.
Well, after those two nexuses, we're going to discuss actually just the complexes I mentioned, and then after that, it's going to be about like the severing of the complex, right? Like the proximity complex, this how you sever it into its pure potential, and then that gives us the window to talk about the archetypes.
Right. That's kind of your domain of study a little more.
Did you say sever the proximity complex?
It's just I think it's just my phrasing of it. Sever it like in a sense of from its dependence on the other complex and the archetypical one that drives like this should be that, this should be this should be
So
that.
we're building the calm in the eye of the hurricane, so to speak.
Yeah.
That outside things don't screw up your inner peace.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll explain it.
Yeah. The arbitrarily selected strike point was physicality, right? For starting off.
Yeah, so we can get right into it. Then that's so we got a good intro.
Definitely.
So where to begin? So we have this model of a holonic structure, which we're using to describe, um, I guess, everything in this entire system. Follows along this model of archetype, model, guild, and holon. Um, so as we were discussing before, I think people can relate to this um, by looking at the physicality of the world around them and kind of like the objective materialist understanding of how atoms come together to make molecules, molecules together to make cells, cells together to make tissues, tissues to organs. So at each point, we're having um, a new, these are all new units, new holons. They're all interacting together, and each is whole unto itself and containing the others. So it's a part, but it's also the whole. Like how you could say a cell is kind of like a whole part, right? But it's also part of an organism. Um,
And then the
It's
key, I think another distinction to note is that not every single cell makes up a full-fledged organism. Like we can be talking about like single-celled organisms, and they are like wholes in their whole. Like they don't have
yeah.
a higher structure that they go by aside from their own
so
social environment, for instance.
so to apply the holon at the cellular level, would the so is that what we're doing? Is that where we're starting off at? Because I mean, you
Yeah.
said you wanted to go over the holon, but you went. I mean, we have guild, model, and archetype, and but we've made
Yep.
the claim that it can be applied
Hmm.
to in a fractal way to our understanding of or the current materialist understanding of the universe.
Hmm.
So if we start by applying the holon to the cell, you would have the guild, which would be the
A bunch
movements
of
of the
cells.
cell.
Yeah.
I mean, just applying the holon to one cell, though.
Oh, okay, okay. So in that case, we're like dealing with things like DNA and proteins and stuff like that.
So, like the structure of the DNA would still be considered the guild because it's a movement, correct? But the abstract information
Right.
that is guiding the movement,
Yeah.
which isn't itself, which is represented within the guild, which includes the structure of the cell's DNA and
So
the movement of the
so
peptidotides.
what we're hitting on is like there's actually several ways to identify this application, even for a single cell. On the one hand side, you reduce it to a single DNA component, right? Where I'm from my perspective, it looks like the DNA plus the proteins plus the full on dance of the whole thing within that sheltered membrane, right?
Yeah,
So that dance is what I'm seeing. Like the proteins are the model, where the DNA is the archetypical structure that represents them, right? So that was the representation I was seeing. You're describing something even more fundamental to the molecule of the DNA itself, where it itself is behaving in a certain way, which is true. Like this is a valid way to look at it as well, that it's behaving a certain way. That could be looked at it as its guild component. Um, the rules, the chemical rules that allow it to fold this way or that way is the model, right? And the arbitrary sequences is the archetypical thing that drives the whole thing together. Um,
Mhm.
should you change the sequence, the entire thing just turns different or disappears entirely. So,
yeah.
did I read you correctly here, or am I just
No, you did because I actually made a mistake in I was trying to apply some sort of logos type abstraction to like the actual information that is being output by the interaction of the constituents of DNA
mhm, mhm.
to translate into the movement of a cell. But there really is no such distinction because uh, the way in which the constituents of the DNA are moved around just by its processing, the cell is moving. And then it just
Yeah,
so happens to be in the way in which the DNA was coded.
yeah, like it's like a huge fun house of reflections, and then incidentally they happen to have like this big coherent pattern that's like you wouldn't even mirror to mirror.
So so you have the moving parts, and you have the model by which those parts are moved, and then you have the archetype. When applied at a unicellular level, would be
The chemistry itself, almost. It's like
Yeah.
it comes from a layer below it, and it's seen in the patterns of that layer, not in anything substantial in self, right? Which is why it
eh,
becomes an indescribable fractal of things, because you can't really find one. You find examples of one. You find
yeah.
an example of a cell that's a member of this grouping, but each one has like this whatever slight differences that you would imagine to have.
So you had mentioned that uh, the archetype would be pointing to what sort of emerged into the cell, like a from below standpoint, but
Right.
also the archetype points to the possibilities of what a cell may, be a part of,
Right,
right?
right.
So it's
Because
like
it's like a chain.
it's like a, yeah, it's like a two-way. So it's a horizon of the
Hmm.
organism in a sense is like is the potential of the archetypical cell to be a part of,
Right,
right? Would
like
you
so we have
say the same?
examples of those chains up to organism, and then we have an example of that going up to society, and so it's really about trying um, to see this pattern through it to its full extent.
So
And
we're
just
So
having.
we've applied the, sorry.
Sorry, I was gonna say these the holons are stacking in like how you how you mentioned that the cell can be part of something bigger. The molecule is the holon below, so that becomes the archetype for the cell itself. So the cell is having it's like the cell is like what can I do with molecules with various configurations of molecules. The DNA is just one of those molecules. The cell walls are molecule are being put together with molecular structures and coherence patterns, right? So the arc you're taking the arc or you're taking the holon from below, which is molecule, and this is what you can do with molecules. A molecule can be configured into a protein. The protein happens to represent most obviously the model of the cell, which is how these how these molecules.
let's just keep in mind that we're given a very simplistic view here, and then there's a lot more to the actual biology than
Yeah.
what we're discussing.
So we're gonna get this. This may be it may be easier to understand this and kind of see how it's working once we get up through the neural OS layers and start matching this to mimetic, abstract, concrete, and shared layers, right?
So yeah, I think we have successfully kind of went into the holon, mapped it at the cellular level, and showed how they relate to each other on a fractal level to provide both, they're sort of the means for fractalization to occur in the way that it appears to occur.
Hmm.
And, they are, that basic structure is present in all levels of that fractalization.
Hmm.
So,
Like
so
just so
now
you
our
have
goal is to,
different
sorry.
types of molecules, you'll have different types of cells, all interacting in
Yeah.
different ways.
Hmm.
And that's,
Um,
that's to do with, guild dynamics and different, just, yeah,
Well,
the
the
front.
guild dynamics has to do with the constraining the mentality, the mental processes that make up a society to kind of continue the chain, right? Like that's the idea there is to sort of like so that it all the pieces are coherent in such a way that they're part of the chain rather than something more arbitrarily constructed, right? Which is where the whole idea of doing what we're doing this for comes coming from to begin
mhm.
with.
There's a
Yeah.
community of holons at each layer as you go up. I
Yeah.
think we can get to that. So going through physicality, like the typical materialistic, objective type worldview of this kind of mechanistic order, we can see we can go up this stack like cell, tissue, organ, organism, like a being, and at one point, Jenya, maybe you can talk to this crossing this bridge, but that we're looking at the neural network as one of these organs, the
Yeah.
brain, or and this is where we're crossing into the neural operating system and the layers of the neural operating system.
Right. So this is where you start to see things like signals, and signals are kind of like this abstraction of a pattern. They're not they're not just like a whole bunch of fibers firing together. They're firing together as a grouping. They're firing together in a concert of a day, like timing wise. They're firing to, you know what I mean? There's like a kind of a interaction going on between them that's sort of self-reflective, and it's the nature of it's what's inside that interaction that begins to matter more as these patterns start to coalesce into greater and greater patterns. um, how do they maintain a concert? How do they remain in harmony with themselves? How does that concert actually translate into so here's a thing for an organism to resolve. This takes a lot of energy. What's the benefit of it all, right? Just simple questions like that, like why grow something like that just like sucks up all your energy for existence. So these
So the
patterns must be
sorry.
have a different effect internally to themselves. So they're self-interacting patterns, and this self-interaction of the patterns themselves is like the where these kinds of questions can be answered as to why the energy is being spent. And then we begin to look at essentially what kind of patterns can we expect. And
Can we look a little bit closer at, for my benefit, if no one else's, at the 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 mechanics of how the holons are relating between the neuron and the signal?
all
Because I
right,
mean,
so
we're going up the stack here, right? And then as you're going up, there's
the patterns of the signals, right, must be somehow beneficial for the organism. That's kind of what I was trying to get at with all my uh, talk there. And so, what is okay? Cool. I just surprised me a little bit there.
Does that help?
Sure, yeah. Um, well, kind of. It has a bit more information than we could potentially need.
Yep. It's the first stack that I found.
Mm-hmm.
where are we at? Okay,
Maybe I
so
can find
we're
the other one.
from
Vestigial,
neurological.
vestigial to from neurological to vestigial,
Yeah.
right? So your body is basically is already set to send a whole bunch of electrical impulses. Let's call them as to separate them from signals. Impulses to just twitch. Let's look at brainless. What do you call them?
So this is to say that the holon doesn't, no
Jellyfish.
aspect of this. Oh, jellyfish.
Yeah, jellyfish doesn't have like it has a neural network, but it doesn't have a brain. The internal network is concerned with simply twitching around and moving the body and reacting to the current, to the felt environment, so to speak. And I think
So the
John.
no, I was going to say the relationship between the neural and signal layer are is sort of akin to that.
Like an already working
I kind of
cell,
lost my train.
say out of chemistry. Right, on the one hand side, you have like that
Okay, but what?
chemical machinery, but on the other hand side, you have like this full-on self-reflective structure. That's kind of like what the signal is. It's a self-reflective bit of information. It's like every time a brain, the neurological system sends a signal, it also interprets the very same signal,
Okay,
right?
that's the bit right there.
right.
Puts it
It's
in its context for me.
right. There's like the reading and writing at the
The
same
signal's
time.
not just the signal's an input. Yeah, it's an input and an output.
Yeah. So like it's gonna
So I
come
mean, of
out
course, it's going to be
and
self-reflective.
plug into something else, and that's going to create, and that's going to pattern a whole bunch of different signals, right? So if this signal has variance, the pattern coming out is going to have a variance, but potentially that variance could be swallowed by some other subsystem, and no, and the same pattern would come out anyway. So this is basically to give it another platform, and this platform gives gives the ability to structure that funhouse I kept talking about in general. The
Yeah,
the Quine relay model that I use to sort of bootstrap the I thinking about it.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah,
It
so
was it is
it would
cool
be
to see it
signal
in.
based. Hmm?
I was just saying it is cool to see it just in the mechanics of the neuron itself between the signal.
Hmm.
And that's where I was. So I mean, of course, the appearance of a funhouse and our perception of reality comes down to, you know, it is reflective of the reflectivity of, the neuron signaling outwards and then creating a representation of that to feed back into itself.
Yeah, yeah. It's because the nerve system is so versatile, right? And there's you can have like these so many like different combinations, and you can move them around a little bit to like I don't know how what the extent is, but we do know that they move. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
it creates quite an elaborate capacity for something like this. So of course you can have different variations of how that can go, and so most signal systems aren't very elaborate, I would say, and they don't go and very hard into like into deeper layers very hard. They're still there in a sort of primordial sense, but um, not say like to the extent where you can utilize it as a tool for yourself. It's just like internal driver mechanism. It's an internal ticker.
yeah. So upon moving into the signal layer and beyond that, we're moving into the realm of, because you're sort of leaving the, I mean, it's still in the stack with physical, but because now we're dealing with structures that are a level of complexity layered upwards, or necessitated by the fact that it's a self-reflective system now,
Yes,
right? Because I mean, the symbol
consequentially.
can't exist without the nature of a signal,
No, it
right?
can't because what the symbol becomes is a sort of like a shaping of a lot of signals. So again, we're getting into territory of patterning the patterns, right? Like and like we're building on top. This is why it's another hole on. It's because it's signals are all this is now the playground of like things that you can take put together, right? And what makes a symbol is like you don't have again. This is an archetypical thing. You don't have the symbol. You have this symbol. You have that symbol. You have this. You know what I mean? Like you again, you get a variety of things here, I, which makes it again itself a whole on the next for the next layer. And so the signals combined together give you like say it's in the same of like this. It's in the same realm of how pen strokes form letters, right? Like you got
Hmm.
up strokes, down strokes, you got round strokes, you got hard strokes, and all of that. But it's the patterning on that makes this letter, that letter, the next letter, the next letter, the next letter, right? So you've increased complexity, you've given variety out of you've created more variety out of some very basic things like up, down, left, right. It's a very limited set of things you can do, but the number of letters you can get out of it
Yeah,
is increased. And then you have the same situation when you say you put words together. and then you have the same situation where you put paragraphs together, right? So
Yeah.
so that like
So, but we're leaving the oh, excuse me. We're leaving the along the stack because from up until this point, we've been looking at it from an angle of okay, you can watch the cell move and do its thing, and you can actually look at
yep.
it. But once it goes into the signal, now it can't be because you can't look at the structure created by the synaptic activity of a group of neurons inside of a brain
Well, I mean, you
and see.
can, but it's incidental to that specific instance, right? It's not going to be like it's that same problem of like you don't have the signal pattern. You have this an instance of it, that instance of it, that instance of it, and they're all going to be always different, right? Like
Okay.
you're starting to get into a situation where keeping track of what one means is going to. I think this is what you're getting at is that it's the recording of the meaning of it is going to become obscured. And this is the same point of we have with the horizon. That's kind of like why there is a horizon in between those, the nerve and the signal. Um, there is
Yeah,
what we
that's
call a
what I was getting
horizon.
at. So it's like to perceive, we have to cross that horizon, and now it's in a more subjective realm because
Hmm.
I mean a symbol would be like red, right?
Yeah, yeah. And what is red until you've seen it?
That's considered a symbol. Exactly. So that's what I'm saying is that is the horizon is this sort of more detached view of I'm looking at the mechanics of a cell and I'm overlaying the holon onto those mechanics up to the neuron. And now, because we're dealing with, we have to examine ourselves, now because
Hmm.
we have to bring it into our direct experience. And so now the holon becomes more embodied than just
Well,
looked at.
this is still like the stuff that's traditionally, I'd say, would be called subconscious. I can't stand the word personally, but um, so we don't have this like direct access to this information. What we have is a reflection of that in its active state, right? Because this is kind of like letters on a page. They don't exist until somebody reads them. Well, they do in the sense that they are left. See, this is where the term artifact really comes from. They're like left behind. So this is like the imprint of the entire process. Like you're done writing. You've been sending signals which have been shaping up symbols which have been creating these artifacts, right? But then so what? Like now these artifacts are going to have an active interpretation on the flip side of everything. So I'm not saying that it's like not the same thing, right? It's just two views of the same process. So it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around that if you can't think of the passive part and the active part as being part of the same thing. So in this case, the analogy I recommend is like reading the bit of text. That the reading bit is what animates, what puts the whole thing into action, right? So this is where we have a distinction,
Like,
another horizon between the artifact and the meme. The reading is like where the mimetic starts. The written stuff left behind, which is the result of the reading itself. Um, that's the artifact, right? So that's the structures that made it happen, made what you read what's there. So right, usually usually I frame it like this: you can't read what's not there, right? Like you're reading what's written. So that's the relationship between the meme and the artifact. Does that make it clearer, or does it obscure things?
well, what it tells me is that, or what it brings to mind is that you can't take any layer of the stack in a vacuum, and they only exist in the way that they do because they're contextualized within the entirety of the stack itself.
All right, pointing
So
that
I
in a
mean,
particular conceptualization specifically. So it's guided by something for sure. It's biased.
We're probably going to get
yeah,
into this this point or method of observing the stack itself. Is that whatever you're doing is always being presented to you in a concrete fashion, or concrete or shared, and to break that down and go into the lower layers, you have to create isomorphisms in your shared or concrete experience which reflect the layers below, and then you run
Yeah,
experiments on them and see if that model is valid, and you can kind of go down the layers that way, but you're always presented with a concrete experience.
yeah, yeah. So this is like it's a bit of a jump to get from where we were, but the point there, I think, is that even though we're going up the stack from like the most basics things to the most um, really abstract things, the point of inversion there is that we don't experience things on the level of a cell. We don't experience things on the level of a particle. We experience things in terms of objects interacting with other objects, and like that's kind of like where we take our perspective of how things have happened from, and we kind of create what we call a narrative from that, which is just a sequence in time really for our purposes, especially for this discussion. So yeah, objects are are the things that are static that are moving through time. So the point I'm trying to make there is that despite the fact that what we've been discussing is that the experience happens several layers above those things mentioned.
Cool. So we're at 7 minutes
yeah.
remaining.
Hmm.
um, where else did we want to go? Did we want to tie this into the
So we
neural OS?
Yeah, I think we need to finish up the layers to get from the memes, so which is the reading. Um, so I guess I can quickly cover the fact that when you are reading something, your mind, you're essentially constructing a whole bunch of concepts and you tying them together to know how they're going to play out in this specific instance in time. So the concepts that you're stringing together you're going to be able to string them together in many different ways, and that's our abstract layer where you have types. So basically, you have a chair, a table, a bunch of people, and you can arrange it into a dining scene, or you can arrange it into a breakfast scene, and you can arrange it into, you know what I mean? Like the instances of how these things are used are always going to be are always going to be generic things that are rearranged into the concrete, and the concrete is always going to be made out of these instances of abstract things that you're putting together to make those concrete things. So that's the so as you're reading the same words over and over and over again, but you're reading them into different sentences, and you're reading the similar sentences but in different paragraphs, right? So all of this means that the words are more abstract than the paragraphs that they make up. The paragraphs are more abstract than the chapters that they make up, right? And each one builds up a narrative, a particular um, concrete set of instances of something happening in a unique way. Each narrative is always unique, right? In this case, it's just a chain of the events. So
Yep.
this is all effects from the reading part of the mimetic part. So to cover all of those layers and how we can tie them back in the next meeting to the Holonic layers is how they themselves build up on the Holon stack to create their shared layer above that, which is more of a mirage experience than the spectacle from which it's made. Right, the spectacle is where the action from the mind takes place, whereas the shared layer and all of that is where the social aspects of it are being put strung together. So while our brain works with objects and actions, we are brushing teeth and cleaning toilets in the shared space of our existence, right? So like the narrative
Mhm.
of that gives it the meaning that we are then used to create a template for the next set of actions that we're going to engage in with the body
Yeah.
and the mechanics of it.
This is like where the hyperstation is and seeing the change over time and having objectives.
Yeah, this is the home of Portal Mountain and all of that stuff.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think
Mm.
that about wraps up how we're going to move into that situation because in the next meeting we're going to have to build up those how those the layers build up the shared layer, and I think that's plenty of conversation for that. And
Cool.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think we could end it here.
So, yeah, might as well. So we'll discuss and carry on with the next section.
We have 3 minutes left. Any lingering thoughts, questions, short ones?
No.
Um, think
I
this went
think
well.
so. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm okay with it, so that's why I'm asking.
All right. Cool.
You were saying, sorry, I
Yep.
cut you off there.
Me, I was saying no. I'm good with where we stopped right now, and I'm ready to get into the next.
Hmm.
Okay. At the very worst, this is. I hope this will potentially just generate questions if things are not clear. So,
Yep.
and we can address them as that's like from anybody in the audience. We can address those questions as they come up for this. So, I hope to hear them because we want to improve this system.
Hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
So we can continue on the next meeting with the mimetic, abstract, concrete, and shared layers, how those tie into the archetype model guild structure, or this idea of the units, whatever it is, convergence, the nexus.
Yeah.
And we can tie it back into the quickly what we were talking about with like the physicality of the cells and like tissues and how which part of that is the guild when you view it concretely, like as Jan was saying, the motions of things, the change over time. Um, which part is the model, all that kind of stuff. And then I think we can get into, um, I'd like to go up layers, up into the guild and how that manifests concretely and how we can utilize this inner structure of the neural OS to organize uh, and make sure that what we do in a social context is coherent. So that's the guild. That's the system of guilds.
Yeah. Which is the yeah, that's like the next logical step from the discussion of the
Hmm.
neurological stuff.
Yeah, just keep going.
Um, but what to say? Well, this is why we have the fork in the road because this also is coinciding with more some more explanatory power in the below layers of what they can offer. So this is where we want to
Right.
kind of splice it up a little bit into between two and two meetings between
Yep. So we'll
switch
kind of
meetings around.
up to a choice as to which one somebody wants to view next. So
Yeah.
either
The,
mimetic.
the the two sequences will be logically equivalent and informing each other.
Yep. Sounds good. All right. I think we better cut it off. Good meeting.
Yep.
Uh, chat and
All right.
reconvene.
Cheers.
Cheers.